Tony Stark loves to define himself as a genius, billionaire, playboy, and philanthropist. But if we look past the armor and the wealth, clinical psychology paints a very different picture. He is a textbook case of avoidant attachment, a man actively dodging emotional intimacy to mask a deep, unhealed sense of inadequacy. To understand his early behavior, we have to start with Sigmund Freud. Freud proposed a model of the human psyche that includes a component called the id. The id is our primitive, impulsive drive. It operates entirely on the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification without any concern for consequences. For the first few decades of his life, Tony's reckless, hedonistic lifestyle was governed almost entirely by this exact drive. His extreme arrogance and his literal iron suits function as psychological defense mechanisms. Specifically, he relies on something called reaction formation, where a person masks their true, vulnerable feelings by outwardly projecting the extreme opposite. By broadcasting overwhelming narcissistic bravado, he guarantees that no one can get close enough to see his actual emotional vacuum. Long before he ever sketched the Mark I armor, Tony's defining superpower was his ability to construct impenetrable psychological walls around his own insecurities. That insecurity traces back to his childhood, where he experienced a severe lack of parental mirroring. Mirroring is the psychological process where a child constructs a stable identity by receiving validating, attentive reactions from their caregivers. His father, Howard Stark, was emotionally distant and perpetually demanding, leaving a massive void where that baseline validation should have been. The psychoanalyst Alfred Adler developed a framework known as individual psychology, which argues that human behavior is often driven by a striving to overcome early feelings of inferiority. Through Adler's lens, Tony's extreme displays of wealth, status, and engineering genius are frantic attempts to overcompensate for the fact that he never felt good enough for his father's approval. This arrested development stalls him in what psychologist Erik Erikson called the intimacy versus isolation stage. Because he fears the rejection he experienced as a child, Tony purposefully sabotages true emotional connection, substituting it with a revolving door of superficial encounters that carry zero emotional risk. Before he ever became a hero, Tony was an emotionally isolated adult trapped in a childhood loop. He was desperately engineering the validation he couldn't naturally achieve. The turning point arrives when two massive traumas shatter his pleasure-driven reality: his grueling captivity in Afghanistan, followed by the alien invasion during the Battle of New York. These events force his psyche into its next phase, governed by the ego, the rational part of the mind that mediates between internal desires and the external world. But his ego is completely hijacked by clinical symptoms. He develops acute hypervigilance, severe insomnia, and crippling panic attacks as his mind aggressively locks itself down against perceived external threats. What we are watching is post-traumatic stress disorder. It is crucial to understand that his PTSD is not a sign of mental weakness. It is a rational, exhausted mind producing a maladaptive response to surviving an impossible threat. Throughout his middle years as an Avenger, Tony's primary battle is rarely against terrestrial terrorists or alien warlords. He is fighting a war against his own hyperactive nervous system. This diagram illustrates Freud's repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to master trauma by exerting absolute control over the environment. This compulsion drives his obsessive, sleepless construction of the Iron Legion. A psychological defense mechanism spirals into an isolating addiction that suffocates his relationships. This context reframes his most disastrous decision, the creation of the Ultron AI. It was a codependent trauma response. Terrified of failing his loved ones, he attempted to build a literal suit of armor around the world. By pushing his engineering to such a massive scale, he creates a rationalization to self-soothe his fear of powerlessness in a universe full of monsters. The resulting catastrophes prove a psychological truth. You cannot solve an internal mental health crisis with external engineering. In his later years, the obsessive building finally slows down. Tony realizes that true peace requires psychological integration and emotional vulnerability, rather than total technological dominance. This aligns with Erik Erikson's adult developmental stage, known as generativity versus stagnation. To pass through this stage successfully, an adult must find purpose by guiding the next generation, and committing to something larger than themselves. We watch him navigate this stage through his mentorship of Peter Parker and, eventually, his role as a father. His psychological drive shifts. He stops seeking validation from the world and focuses entirely on providing it to the people who depend on him. The ultimate antidote to decades of trauma was the very intimacy and vulnerability he had spent his entire life building armor to avoid. This brings us to the final phase of Freud's model, the superego. The superego represents a fully formed moral conscience, a psychological state that prioritizes the collective good above the individual's own survival. The psychologist Abraham Maslow mapped out a similar trajectory. Late in his life, Maslow amended his famous hierarchy of needs, clarifying that achieving your own potential, known as self-actualization, is not actually the peak of human development. As this diagram demonstrates, Maslow defined the true final stage as self-transcendence, abandoning the ego to commit to a greater cause. Tony's fatal decision to wield the stones is the literal embodiment of this state. He acts from a total surrender of the self. True heroism is not the absence of trauma, anxiety, or defense mechanisms. Instead, it is the grueling, lifelong work of evolving past your own ego to serve the greater good. Which psychological hurdle in Tony Stark's journey resonated the most with you? Let us know down in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss our next dive into the mind of Gotham's darkest detective.